Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson, and this is the Erickson Report. And I got several things I want to cover this time. We're going to see, we're still doing this kind of a little more free flow kind of show. And again, if you have any responses, any comments, any reactions, please, they are very welcome. Whether they're good, bad, or whether you're just going to say, I don't think it makes a difference one way or the other. So again, want to keep gathering comments before we finally decide which way we're going to go with this. I will start, however, by saying that the one disadvantage of doing it this way is that you're more likely to make mistakes. So I've got a few corrections from the last show that I have to make. For one thing, I had cited talking about the overturning of Roe, I had cited Roe v. Casey and Roe v. Wade, and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, which are the two major precedents that are being overturned, apparently. And citing the Casey case, I made reference to its actual full name, which is Planned Parenthood of Southeast Pennsylvania v. Casey. Unfortunately, I called it Planned Parenthood of Southeast Massachusetts v. Casey. Why, I have no idea, but I do know if you look for that case, you got very confused. Another case, Lawrence v. Texas, was a case, it was a Supreme Court decision that struck down laws against sodomy. I called it Lawrence v. Kansas. Again, if you look for Lawrence v. Kansas, you would have been very confused. And when I was talking about the states doing some pushback or dealing with the prospect of Roe being overturned, I accidentally got off into a different topic at one point, which I had intended to talk about later, but actually never got to, as it turned out, which is about LGBTQ rights. I referred to a bill in California that actually would have involved California courts not enforcing judgments in other states that took children from their parents for providing them gender-affirming care. Any warrants or cases like judgments like that would be unenforceable in California. I had actually, instead of that, I had meant at that point to refer to a bill in California which is moving through the legislature that would make the right to an abortion part of the state constitution. That bill is not yet passed, but it's expected to. Some states actually have done this. I think I might have mentioned this. Connecticut has passed a law making any such out-of-state judgments relating to abortion care unenforceable in Connecticut. Colorado has put the right to an abortion in state law, and other states have also done pushback against this. Another sort of, let's call it a half correction, I cited a statistic that said that women were 46 times more likely to die in pregnancy and childbirth than from an abortion, to point out there actually are real health dangers to pregnancy and childbirth. Unfortunately, I can't find those figures, can't find where I got them from. So I have to drop that. However, I did find two other studies, one of which said there were that pregnancy and childbirth was 40 times more likely to see the woman die than abortion. Another said 33 times. So still, it is significantly more dangerous for a woman to go through pregnancy and childbirth than it is to get an abortion. And I should make as a footnote to that, the rate of maternal death in the United States is the highest among the G7 group of industrialized nations. All right, moving on from corrections. It's necessary again. Sometimes you don't know why you bother, but it is necessary. On May 14th, 10 people were killed, 3 more were injured in a horrible, racially motivated, white supremacist attack on a supermarket in Buffalo, New York. A lot of attention in the wake of this has been given to the racism, to the bigotry, the planning that was involved, the hatred. And it's altogether proper that that's what has been done. But I wanted to talk about the guns. One more time, talk about the guns. Because this is not just a racial shooting. It was the deadliest mass shooting of the year so far in the United States. And it was also the 198th mass shooting in the United States in 2022. Mass shootings being defined as 4 or more people shot, not counting the shooter, in one or some closely related incidents. 198 mass shootings in 19 weeks, over 10 a week in the United States. Even on that same weekend that Buffalo happened, May 14th, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 17 people in a crowd were just wounded by various random shots being fired into the crowd, a crowd that was leaving an NBA game. May 15th, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, 7 people were wounded in a string of what police say are related shootings. May 15th, Laguna Woods, California, 1 dead, 5 injured in a shooting at Geneva Presbyterian Church. This one driven by racial animus against a Taiwanese. Being shot by a gun has become the leading cause of fatal injuries among children in the United States. More children die from guns than die from car crashes or suffocation or drowning or poisoning or anything else. And the rate of death by gun among children has risen 30% since 2019, which corresponds with a sharp increase in gun purchases over that same time. Guns accounted for more than 45,000 deaths in the United States in 2020, and that's according to the CDC, and that is a record. That is around 125 people dying a day. We hear about the mass shootings where they touch us, they prick our consciences, but they are only a small fraction of the grinding day-to-day bloodshed that guns bring to this country. And not just murders, not just that, suicides by gun account for over half of the total gun deaths. And they also account for half of all suicide attempts. And there's a tragedy hidden within that tragedy, okay? Guns account for 50% of suicide deaths, but only 10% of suicide attempts. Because 90% of the people who attempt suicide with a gun succeed. 90% of the people who attempt suicide by some other means fail, and those people who survive rarely ever try again. And although we seem to have given up on this, we don't even seem to talk about this, and there are still people fighting the good fight. But overall, as a society, we seem to just given up on the idea. I will continue to say that this country, so much violence is driven by the fact that there are too damn many guns that are too damn easy to get. According to the most recent survey of gun ownership, this is the 2017 Small Arms Survey. This is the most recent worldwide data we have. In the United States, there are about 120 guns for every 100 people. That is by far the highest rate of gun ownership in the world, in fact, nearly double the number 2. And sometimes I feel like, why do I even bother with this? Why do I even bother talking about it? Because some people, too many people, seem determined not just but to make it easier. Not just say there are too many guns, but to make it easier instead to get guns, even to celebrate the idea of guns, guns, and more guns. On May 11th, a panel of the San Francisco-based Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that California's ban on the sale of semi-automatic rifles to people under 21 is unconstitutional. You can't tell a teenager that they can't get an AR-15. Claiming the law violates the Second Amendment. And even beyond that, the court actually said in its ruling, I'm quoting the ruling, America would not exist without the heroism of young adults who fought in our Revolutionary Army. Today we affirm that our Constitution still protects that right that enabled their sacrifice, the right of young adults to keep and bear arms. So in other words, children have to be able to get AR-15s because 200 plus years ago, some people used muskets in the revolution. And by the way, the revolution ended 8 years before the Second Amendment was adopted, so I don't really see the connection here at all, but never mind, because they don't care. Something related to that. Something related to that. Not the same, but related to it. Related to violence, related to death. Over the past decade, the Anti-Defamation League has counted about 450 murders in the United States committed by political extremists. Okay, they've tracked this. Of those murders, 75% were committed by right-wing extremists. Over half of the total was white supremacists. Islamic extremists were responsible for about 20%. Left-wing extremists, which included the categories of black nationalists and anarchists, although I'm not really sure anarchists would consider themselves leftists, since usually anarchists believe in no government, and leftists are usually accused of wanting too much government, but anyway, that's how they categorize it for this. Left-wing extremists were responsible for only 4% of the total. Now, what the data shows, what this data clearly shows, is that the American political right has a violence problem that has no equivalence on the left. The data is so clear, the data is so definitive here, that the gap is so great that even the New York Times, one of those bastions of both sidesism, one of those bastions of, well, you know, there's extremists on both sides. They had to acknowledge that this is an issue of the right, that there is no equivalence of this on the left. And so we should never, ever, ever be willing to put up with that nonsense that the left and the right are both equally violent. And all those things you see on the right wing, you see on Fox News and all those other places about how we need to talk about the violence of the left. That's not where the violence is coming from. All right, what else have I got? Oh, something else. May 11th. May 11th was apparently a big day. A veteran Palestinian-American journalist named Shireen AbuKhala was shot in the head and killed, despite wearing a helmet and a bulletproof vest, both clearly labeled in bright block letters, press. She at the time was reporting on Israeli military aids in the West Bank city of Jenin. Now, the Israeli government, of course, immediately blamed Palestinians for the death. Of course, it had to be. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett claimed there's a significant possibility that AbuKhala was killed by Palestinian crossfire. The IDF is the Israeli Defense Forces. The chief of the IDF, Major General Aviv Kochavi, said, I'm quoting, Palestinians fired extensively at our forces, wildly and indiscriminately in every direction. Unlike the Palestinians, IDF soldiers carry out professional and selective firing. And the Israeli Ministry of Defense shared a video which it claimed depicted Palestinian terrorists who likely killed AbuKhala. Except it turned out from both eyewitnesses and from video evidence that there are no Palestinian fighters, no Palestinian shooters, no Palestinian militants anywhere near where AbuKhala was shot. And the video that the Israeli government presented was actually taken several hundred yards away. It was down a street, up an alley, across a courtyard, and up another alley that far away from where she was shot. As the lies fell apart, the Israeli police, even as their lies fell apart, the Israeli police actually attacked her funeral procession to the point of hitting with clubs the people who were carrying her coffin, almost causing them to just drop it. And that time, the video evidence was so clear that the police couldn't deny that they did it. Instead, they claimed they were protecting the coffin from rioters who were trying to steal it. The evidence was so clear that that claim was treated with the derision that it deserved. It was treated with derision with good cause. Because this is not the first time this has happened. Since 2000, at least 45 journalists have been killed by the IDF, have been shot and killed by the IDF. Oh, yes, these things happen. These are mistakes and things can happen. Yeah, remember how the IDF was, IDF soldiers carry out professional and selective firing. Though in essence, the Israeli government admits that the journalists that their soldiers killed was done on purpose because they're professional and selective in who they shoot. Even so, don't worry. Israel promises a thorough investigation. And I'm sure that after a careful consideration of all the evidence, Israeli officials will decide that there's actually no way of knowing who fired the shot. But it was such a tragedy, and we always strive to learn from such events. In other words, what will happen is nothing. What should happen here is a different form of nothing. In 2016, the U.S. and Israel signed a memorandum of understanding, under which the U.S. pledged to provide $3.8 billion in military aid to Israel every year for 10 years. And according to the USAID, that's the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, total U.S. aid to Israel, total, from 1946 to 2021, measured in 2021 dollars, has been $247 billion in military aid. The nothing here is that Israel should get no more. They should get nothing. They deserve nothing, not a penny. Israel has become an outlaw state, and the behavior of Israel will not stop until there are consequences. But instead of consequences, what do we see? During the House action on the National Defense Authorization Act, an amendment to stop $735 million sale of munitions to Israel was killed by the Rules Committee. And in a separate bill, passed that same day, the House approved $1 billion to supply Iron Dome missiles to Israel. Only 9 House members voted no on that bill. Which means the chances of there actually being any consequences to Israel are sadly very, very slim, and even that seems like an overly optimistic statement. But even if doing it wouldn't make any difference, even if we could cut off the aid and it wouldn't make any difference in how Israel behaves, that may even be true. But I still say now, as I said a long, long time ago, that even if we can't stop the hangman's hand, we can at least stop paying for the noose. All right. Last time, going back to something I talked about last time, which was the economy. But I cut myself off because I was running out of time, so I wanted to quickly go over some other things and sort of back up and quickly cover some of what I covered before to sort of get a running start on this. It's the fact that I was reading articles about the causes of inflation and noting how they never mentioned corporate profits. They never mentioned corporate profits, despite the fact that corporate profit margins are the biggest they've been in 70 years, up 25% in 2021. Over the second half of 2021, up 37%. In the first quarter of 2022, Exxon's profits doubled over the previous year. Chevron's quadrupled. According to analysis by the newspaper Guardian of Securities and Exchange Commission's filings, for 100 U.S. corporations, net profits were up by a median of 49%. And they compared first quarter 2022 to the first quarter of 2020, which means nobody can even blame the COVID crash for depressing profits last year. And companies were bragging about jacking up their prices more than their costs in order to increase their profits. And it's not just corporations that were doing this. According to the Wall Street Journal, 2021 was the 6th consecutive year to set a new record for executive compensation. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% of Americans have a collective net worth of less than zero. And the 44% of the U.S., which is also a record, are in low-paying jobs. According to the World Inequality Report, inequality is growing around the world, but it's particularly growing in the United States. The wealth gap between the richest and the poorest in the U.S. more than doubled between 1989 and 2016. Meanwhile, the richest family, something explained to you, economists talk about the economy in terms of wealth and income in quintals, 20%, the richest 20%, next 20%, the middle 20%, and so on. Well, the richest 20% of us over the last 15 years are the only quintil that has gained in wealth. The median net worth of the top 20% between 2007 and 2016 increased 13%. For below 80%, those 4 quintils down, every one of them declined in wealth, somewhere between 20 and 39%. Now, yes, it's true that unemployment is down and sustained job growth has been good. But the fact is, low unemployment is no help if there aren't jobs to be found. We're not back. I mean, all this job growth, we are still behind where we were before COVID hit. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Moody's Analytics, 20 states will not see a full jobs recovery. They'll not be back to the number of jobs available until the end of 2024, and 14 more won't be available, won't reach even then. What's the result? Now, right now, there are 3.8 million people who are unemployed. There are no jobs for them to have, and their unemployment's been used up. On the other hand, though, we have had to invent a new term, centibillionaire. We've had to invent a term to describe people who are worth over $100 billion each. There are 8 of centibillionaires in the world. 7 of them are Americans. The problem is not that we face is not inflation. Former Labor Secretary Robert Reich said it. Mega corporations could easily absorb the higher costs. They're not raising prices because they have to. They're doing it because they can. The problem, he said, is corporate greed. But it's more than that. It's not just corporate greed. It's the greed of the rich. It's wealth income inequality. That's the elephant in the room. But people are still saying that inflation is the real problem. And you need to ask yourself why. Why do you say that that's the biggest problem? Because you are being told that constantly through the media by the very people who benefit from you focusing on that as opposed to their increasing wealth and the increasing wealth inequality. And one last thing on this. Don't let yourself be tricked into thinking that Democrats are the answer. That all we have to do is elect more and better Democrats. All we have to do is just vote for Democrats, and that will solve everything. It won't. Not when coming into office, the Biden administration coming into office, pledging to be tougher on corporate crime, only to have a new report published late in April showing that corporate prosecutions reached a record low in 2021. Not when the Congress has passed, in fact, just as to reconcile it, $52 billion in subsidies for the microchip industry. While in the course of this, in the Senate, an amendment to simply say that none of these subsidies should go to corporations engaged in legal union busting was shot down in the Senate 87-6. Meanwhile, there is a move by a Democrat in the Senate to restore a tax cut that benefits corporate America, that's as described by the Washington Post, that was supposed to expire this year, but now it's being extended and continued. It's a tax cut that's worth to corporate America $140 billion. I'm sorry, $130 billion over 4 years. Only 4 Democrats in the Senate voted against that measure. So look, are the Democrats better than Republicans? Are the Democrats as a whole? Of course, there are some good Democrats, like those 4. But as a whole, are the Democrats better than the Republicans? Yes, they are. They are. But the fact is, based on 5-year survival rates, lung cancer is 5 times more likely to kill you than colon cancer is. That doesn't mean colon cancer is a good thing to have. All right, I got a few minutes. I got maybe 4 or 5 minutes left. So see how much of this I can get, because I just find this such a moral outrage. At a news conference recently, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said the U.S. wants, quote, to see Russia weaken to the degree that it can't do the kinds of things that it has done in invading Ukraine. While U.S. officials are saying Ukraine could win this war with the right equipment and the right support. And this was said right before Biden said he wants another $33 billion for the war, including $20 billion in arms to Ukraine. Because, he said, this will ensure that Ukraine can fend off Russian attacks in the months ahead. This is where it gets important, the months ahead. And we begin to transition to longer-term security assistance. CNN actually said that U.S. and foreign officials were reporting to CNN saying that Russia needs to be hurt so much economically on the battlefield that its aggression is stopped. The network quoted an unnamed congressional source. This is the quote. The way we're looking at this is that it's making an investment to neuter the Russian army and navy for a decade. In other words, they want this war to continue for months on end. They want this war to drain and hurt and pain. This is not a war to defend Ukraine, assuming it ever was. It's a proxy war, a war of NATO against Russia, with the bodies and lives and homes of Ukrainians being the board on which this game is played. The problem is that, like every war, this has its own logic. War drops a magnet on our moral compass, makes it spin in all directions. In fact, Ukraine has used anti-personnel weapons, cluster bombs, banned weapons on a Russian-controlled village, not on Russian soldiers, on the village. Although it's worth noting that Ukraine is one of the very few nations that is not banned, not joined the ban on cluster bombs. 2 of the others being Russia and the U.S. Now, I've said before, as a pacifist, I cannot endorse the sending of weapons, but I can endorse all of the economic and political and social sanctions put on Russia for this. But I have to say that if your interest is really in defense, not conquest, in protecting life and independence, not in dominance, you need to ask at what point is what there is still to be gained is worth the cost. U.S. officials have already said what Ukraine is going through, what the people of Ukraine are going through, is worth it to weaken Russia. Worth it, that is, when you're not the one paying the cost. But it's time for Ukraine to ask. It's time for someone to tell Volodymyr Zelensky to step back, to stop dreaming of victory, because he is. He's dreaming of victory, actively encouraged by the U.S. and NATO. He's envisioning outright victory, and it's time to ask him to stop thinking of that prospect and start thinking of more of the cost of it. I'm going to stop there. Okay, I have to stop myself there. And in fact, I've only got about a minute left, so Russia's not going to conquer Ukraine. It's not going to happen. And as long as the NATO arms keep pouring in, and they will, it's more likely Ukraine grind Russia down than the other way around. The question for Zelensky is doing that really worth the continuing and additional cost to your people it will take to do it? Because if you're saying that it's all about freedom, I have to ask you, who among us can free the dead? That said, I'm out of here. You have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. We'll see you then. Peace.